The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the cobblestones of Windsor Castle's main courtyard, as hundreds of tourists shuffled about with their cameras and guidebooks. Among them was Marcus Thompson, a loud American businessman from Texas who had made his fortune in oil and wasn't shy about letting everyone know it. He wore an expensive polo shirt, designer sunglasses, and a gold watch that caught the light with every gesture of his hands. Marcus had been touring Europe for 2 weeks, with his wife Sarah and their teenage son, Jake. While Sarah quietly admired the historical architecture and Jake scrolled through his phone, Marcus had developed an unfortunate habit of treating every landmark like his personal entertainment venue. He'd already been asked to lower his voice at Westminster Abbey and had received disapproving looks at the Tower of London for his inappropriate jokes about the crown jewels. At Windsor Castle, the family joined the crowd gathering to watch the changing of the guard ceremony. The tourists formed a semicircle around the designated area, where the royal guards would soon perform their traditional duties. Marcus pushed his way to the front, ignoring the polite protests of other visitors who had been waiting patiently for their spot. Standing at his post was Guardsman James Mitchell, a 26-year-old soldier who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard. James stood perfectly still in his iconic red tunic and tall black bearskin hat, his rifle held at attention. His face showed no emotion as tourists snapped photos and whispered comments about the guard's ability to remain motionless for hours. Marcus noticed James immediately and began making comments to his family about the ridiculous costume and waste of taxpayer money. His voice carried across the courtyard, causing other tourists to glance in his direction with embarrassment. Sarah tugged at her husband's sleeve, trying to quiet him, but Marcus was just getting started. "Look at this guy," Marcus said loudly, pointing directly at James. "Standing there like a statue. Bet he can't even think for himself. Probably gets paid to be a decoration." Some tourists nearby began to move away, uncomfortable with Marcus's behavior, while others stayed to see what would happen next. James had heard every word but maintained his professional composure. In his years of service, he had encountered countless tourists who tried to get a reaction from the guards. Some would make faces, others would tell jokes, and a few would even try to touch the guards or their equipment. James had been trained to ignore all distractions and maintain the dignity of his position. But Marcus wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and began recording a video, walking closer to James while speaking loudly for his social media followers back home. "Here I am at Windsor Castle, looking at one of these famous guards who can't move or talk. Let's see if we can get a reaction out of this robot." The crowd began to grow as more tourists noticed the commotion. Some looked concerned, others curious, and a few appeared to be enjoying the spectacle. Sarah's face reddened with embarrassment as she realized her husband was becoming the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. Marcus stepped even closer to James, now just 3 feet away from the guard. He began making exaggerated facial expressions and waving his hands, trying to catch James's attention. "Hello there, soldier boy. Earth to guard. Anyone home in there?" His voice echoed off the castle walls, and even the tour guides began to notice the disruption. Jake, the teenager, finally looked up from his phone and saw what his father was doing. His face flushed with shame as he realized dozens of people were watching, and some were recording the incident on their own phones. He wanted to disappear into the crowd but felt frozen in place, much like the guard his father was harassing. James continued to stare straight ahead, his training taking over completely. He focused on a point in the distance, using meditation techniques he had learned during his military service to block out the distraction. His breathing remained steady and controlled, even as sweat began to form under his heavy uniform in the summer heat. The situation escalated when Marcus decided to get creative with his harassment. He began dancing around James, making silly faces and gestures while maintaining his video recording. "Look at this, everyone. I could probably take his hat and he wouldn't even notice. These guys are like mannequins in a store window." An elderly British gentleman in the crowd finally spoke up. "Sir, please show some respect. These are professional soldiers, not entertainment for your amusement." His voice carried the authority of someone who had likely served in the military himself, but Marcus brushed off the criticism with a wave of his hand. "Oh, lighten up, Grandpa," Marcus replied dismissively. "It's just a bit of fun. Besides, I'm an American citizen and I can do whatever I want as long as I'm not breaking any laws. And last time I checked, taking pictures and making jokes wasn't illegal. The tension in the crowd continued to build as more people became aware of the situation. Some tourists began taking their own videos, not of the guards, but of Marcus's increasingly inappropriate behavior. Social media would later show dozens of different angles of what was about to unfold, but none of the observers could have predicted how the situation would ultimately resolve. James remained perfectly still throughout the entire ordeal, his years of training and natural discipline keeping him focused on his duty. But behind his stoic exterior, his mind was working carefully, observing every detail of the situation and preparing for whatever might come next. The tourist had no idea that he was not dealing with a simple ceremonial guard, but with a highly trained soldier who had faced far more serious challenges than an obnoxious American with a camera. As Marcus prepared for his next move, completely unaware of what he was about to trigger, the crowd held its collective breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen in the ancient courtyard of Windsor Castle. Marcus's confidence grew with each passing moment as James remained motionless. Emboldened by what he perceived as weakness, Marcus decided to push the boundaries even further. He stepped closer until he was just inches away from the guard's face, close enough that James could smell the expensive cologne and the lingering scent of the whiskey Marcus had consumed during lunch. "I bet this guy doesn't even know I'm here," Marcus announced to his growing audience, his phone still recording every moment. "Watch this, folks." He began waving his hands directly in front of James's face, moving side to side like he was trying to hypnotize someone. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the situation continued to escalate beyond what anyone considered appropriate behavior. Sarah finally found her voice and stepped forward, grabbing her husband's arm. "Marcus, please stop this. You're embarrassing us and being completely disrespectful." Her face was bright red with shame as she noticed other tourists staring at them with obvious disapproval. But Marcus shrugged off his wife's concerns with irritation. "Sarah, go stand over there with Jake if you can't handle a little fun. I paid good money for this vacation, and I'm going to enjoy myself however I see fit." His voice had grown louder and more aggressive, showing a side of him that his family rarely saw in public. Jake, meanwhile, had slowly backed away from his parents, hoping to distance himself from the scene. At 17 years old, he was acutely aware of how social media worked and could already imagine the embarrassing videos of his father circulating online. He pulled out his own phone, not to record, but to check if anyone was already posting about the incident. Marcus turned his attention back to James and decided to escalate his harassment to a new level. He began telling crude jokes and making inappropriate comments about the guard's appearance and uniform. "Look at this fancy outfit. Bet it costs more than most people make in a month. All this for standing around and looking pretty." His words carried across the courtyard, causing several elderly visitors to shake their heads in disgust. James maintained his professional composure, but those who looked closely could see the slight tension in his jaw muscles. His military training had taught him to endure far worse than verbal harassment. But the disrespect being shown to his uniform, and his service was beginning to test even his considerable patience. A security officer, stationed nearby, had been monitoring the situation and began walking slowly toward the crowd. He was a middle-aged man named Robert, who had worked at Windsor Castle for over 15 years and had seen every type of tourist behavior imaginable. He recognized the signs of a situation that might need intervention, but he also knew the guards were capable of handling most problems themselves. Marcus noticed the security officer's approach and seemed to take it as a challenge rather than a warning. "Oh, here comes the cavalry," he announced sarcastically. "What are you going to do, arrest me for talking? I thought this was supposed to be a free country." His American accent became more pronounced as his agitation increased, and several British tourists exchanged knowing looks about the ugly American stereotype being displayed before them. The security officer stopped a few feet away and spoke in a calm, professional voice. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back and show proper respect for our guards. They are serving soldiers who deserve your courtesy, not your mockery." His tone was polite but carried an unmistakable authority that had intimidated many troublemakers over the years. Marcus laughed dismissively and turned back to James. "Did you hear that?" "Soldier boy, your bodyguard thinks you need protecting from little old me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a 20-pound note, waving it in front of James's face. "Here's some tip money. Maybe you can use it to buy yourself some real clothes when you get off work." The crowd gasped audibly at this latest insult. Even tourists from other countries recognized the profound disrespect being shown to a member of the Queen's Guard. Several people began taking photos and videos, not of the guard but of Marcus's inappropriate behavior. The incident was rapidly becoming a social media moment, but not in the way Marcus intended. James's training had prepared him for many situations, but the combination of personal insults, disrespect to his uniform, and now the attempted bribery was approaching the limits of what any professional soldier should be expected to tolerate. His breathing remained controlled, but his focus had shifted from passive endurance to active assessment of the threat level. Sarah made one final attempt to intervene, stepping between her husband and the guard. "Marcus, enough. This has gone too far. We need to leave right now before you make this any worse." Her voice carried a desperation that showed she understood the gravity of the situation better than her husband did. But Marcus was beyond listening to reason. The attention from the crowd, the recording on his phone, and his own inflated ego had combined to create a perfect storm of bad judgment. He pushed past his wife and stepped even closer to James, now close enough that his breath fogged the guard's uniform buttons. "I want to see what happens when I do this," Marcus announced to his audience, reaching out his hand toward James's rifle. The crowd collectively held its breath as they realized the tourist was about to cross a line that could have serious consequences. Several people began backing away, sensing that the situation was about to change dramatically. James's eyes, which had been focused on a distant point, suddenly shifted to track Marcus's movement toward his weapon. For the first time since the harassment began, the guard's attention was fully focused on the immediate threat. His training kicked in automatically as he assessed the situation and prepared to respond according to his protocols. The security officer stepped forward quickly, recognizing that Marcus was about to trigger a response that would end his vacation in a very unpleasant way. "Sir, do not touch that weapon or the guard. I'm warning you that any physical contact will result in immediate arrest and potential criminal charges." But Marcus was too caught up in his performance to heed the warning. He reached out toward James's rifle, apparently believing that his status as a tourist would protect him from any consequences. The crowd watched in horrified fascination as the American businessman prepared to make the biggest mistake of his European vacation. In that moment, time seemed to slow down as everyone present realized they were about to witness something extraordinary unfold in the courtyard of Windsor Castle. The moment Marcus's fingers came within inches of James's rifle, everything changed. In a movement so swift and precise that most observers barely saw it happen, James executed a perfect military maneuver. He stepped back with his left foot, pivoted his body 90 degrees, and brought his rifle across his chest in a defensive position that both protected his weapon and created a clear barrier between himself and the potential threat. The transformation was remarkable. 1 second, James had been a motionless ceremonial figure, and the next he had become a clearly trained soldier demonstrating exactly why royal guards are chosen from elite military units. His eyes, which had been focused on the distance, now locked directly onto Marcus with an intensity that made the businessman take an involuntary step backward. "Sir, step away from the guard immediately," James commanded in a voice that carried the authority of someone who had given orders in combat situations. His accent was crisp and professional, but there was an underlying steel that made it clear this was not a request. The rifle remained in a defensive position, not threatening but obviously ready to be used if necessary. Marcus was so shocked by the sudden change that he almost dropped his phone. For the first time since arriving at Windsor Castle, he was speechless. The statue he had been mocking had just revealed itself to be a highly trained professional who was clearly capable of handling any threat. The businessman's face went pale as he realized he had seriously misjudged the situation. The crowd, which had been watching the harassment with growing discomfort, suddenly found themselves witnessing something entirely different. Many tourists began applauding spontaneously, not just for the guard's response, but in relief that someone had finally put an end to Marcus's inappropriate behavior. The sound of clapping echoed off the castle walls as people showed their approval for James's professional handling of the situation. Sarah rushed to her husband's side, grabbing his arm and trying to pull him away from the guard. "Come on, Marcus, we're leaving right now," she said urgently, her voice shaking with embarrassment and fear about what might happen next. She had never seen her husband so completely outmaneuvered, and she could sense that the situation could still get worse if they didn't retreat immediately. Jake, watching from his position near the edge of the crowd, felt a mixture of shame and admiration. While he was mortified by his father's behavior, he couldn't help but be impressed by the guard's professional response. The teenager had played enough video games and watched enough action movies to recognize real military bearing when he saw it, and James clearly possessed it in abundance. The security officer, Robert, stepped forward with obvious relief. He had been preparing to intervene more forcefully, but James's response had effectively de-escalated the situation while maintaining the dignity of the guard. "Sir," Robert addressed Marcus firmly, "I need you to move away from the guard area immediately and remain with your family for the duration of your visit." Marcus, still stunned by the guard's transformation, tried to regain some of his lost composure. "Hey, I wasn't actually going to touch anything," he protested weakly. "I was just having some fun. You people need to lighten up." But his voice lacked the confidence it had carried just moments before, and even he seemed to realize how hollow his words sounded. James maintained his defensive position for several more seconds, his eyes never leaving Marcus. When he was satisfied that the threat had passed, he executed another precise military movement, returning to his original position with the same fluid grace he had shown when responding to the threat. Within moments, he was once again the motionless ceremonial guard, staring into the distance as if nothing had happened. The crowd watched this transformation with amazement. Many tourists had visited multiple royal sites and had never seen a guard break from their ceremonial role. The fact that James had done so and then returned to his duty with such professionalism only increased their respect for both him personally and the institution he represented. An elderly British man who had been watching the entire incident approached Marcus with a stern expression. "Young man," he said, using a term that was clearly meant to be condescending given Marcus's age, "those guards are not entertainers. They are professional soldiers who have served their country with honor. The gentleman you just harassed likely has more courage and integrity in his little finger than you've shown in your entire visit to our country." Several other tourists nodded in agreement with the elderly man's words. A woman with a thick Scottish accent added, "That guard showed remarkable restraint. In my day, you would have been arrested immediately for approaching a soldier's weapon." Her comment drew murmurs of approval from other visitors, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Marcus's behavior. Marcus looked around the crowd and realized that the situation had turned completely against him. What had started as his attempt to entertain himself and his social media followers had become a public humiliation. Every face he could see showed disapproval or disgust, and several people were still recording the aftermath of his confrontation with the guard. A family from Germany approached James and asked politely if they could take a photo with him. The guard, back in his ceremonial role, remained motionless, but the family positioned themselves respectfully at a distance and took their picture without trying to interact with him directly. The contrast between their behavior and Marcus's could not have been more stark. Robert, the security officer, continued to monitor Marcus and his family closely. While the immediate crisis had passed, he was concerned about the possibility of further incidents. He had seen tourists react poorly to public embarrassment before, and Marcus's personality suggested he might try to cause more trouble as a way of saving face. James, meanwhile, had returned completely to his professional duties, but he remained alert for any further problems. His response to the threat had been automatic, the result of years of training and experience, but he was aware that the situation might not be completely resolved. Tourists who had been humiliated sometimes attempted to retaliate in other ways. As the minutes passed and normal activity resumed around the guard post, it became clear that Marcus's attempt to humiliate a royal guard had backfired spectacularly. Instead of exposing weakness or absurdity, he had demonstrated the professionalism and competence of the Queen's Guard. The incident was already being shared on social media, but the narrative was not what Marcus had intended when he started recording his video. As the immediate tension began to fade, Marcus found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. The crowd that had gathered to watch his antics was now clearly on the side of the guard, and several people were making pointed comments about inappropriate tourist behavior. He looked at his phone and realized he was still recording, capturing his own humiliation for posterity. Sarah tugged at her husband's sleeve more insistently. "Marcus, we need to go. Now." Her voice carried an urgency that finally seemed to penetrate his shocked state. She could see other tourists taking photos and videos of them, and she understood that this incident could follow them for years if it went viral on social media. But Marcus's pride was wounded, and he wasn't ready to admit complete defeat. He turned to address the crowd, raising his voice in an attempt to regain some control of the narrative. "Look, I wasn't trying to cause any real trouble here. I was just trying to have a little fun on my vacation. You people are acting like I committed some kind of crime." A middle-aged woman from Australia stepped forward, her voice clear and firm. "Sir, you were harassing a working soldier who was performing his duty. In any civilized society, that behavior is unacceptable, regardless of whether it's technically legal." Her words drew nods of agreement from other tourists, and Marcus could see that public opinion was overwhelmingly against him. James continued to maintain his post with perfect military bearing, but the incident had not gone unnoticed by other members of the guard. 2 other soldiers stationed nearby had observed the situation and were communicating through subtle hand signals, ensuring that they were prepared to assist if the situation escalated further. Their presence added an additional layer of authority to the scene. Jake, Marcus's teenage son, finally approached his parents with obvious embarrassment. "Dad, everyone's taking videos of this. Do you want to be known as the guy who got owned by a British guard? Because that's what's going to happen if we don't leave right now." The teenager's understanding of social media dynamics was far better than his father's, and he could already imagine the memes and commentary that would emerge from the incident. The reality of his son's words began to sink in for Marcus. He looked around at the dozens of phones pointed in his direction and realized that his confrontation with the guard was being documented from multiple angles. His original plan to create entertaining content for his social media had backfired completely, and now he was likely to become the subject of content that portrayed him in the worst possible light. Robert, the security officer, approached the family again with a more formal demeanor. "Sir, I'm going to need to escort you to the visitor center to complete an incident report. While no laws were broken, your behavior toward our guard was inappropriate and needs to be documented." His tone made it clear that this was not optional, and Marcus realized that his vacation was about to become significantly more complicated. An elderly gentleman who had been watching the entire incident approached James and spoke quietly. "Well done, lad. You handled that with exactly the right amount of professionalism and restraint." While James could not respond while on duty, the appreciation in the man's voice was clear, and several other tourists murmured their agreement. Marcus overheard the comment and made one final attempt to defend his actions. Professionalism? The guy just stood there like a robot until he suddenly decided to play soldier. If he'd just been friendly from the beginning, none of this would have happened. His words fell flat with the crowd, and several people openly scoffed at his attempt to blame. The guard for the situation, a tour guide, who had been leading a group nearby, stepped forward with information that completely changed Marcus's perspective on the incident. "That gentleman you were harassing," she said, pointing toward James, "is Guardsman James Mitchell. He served 2 combat tours in Afghanistan before joining the Queen's Guard. He's been decorated for valor under fire and has saved the lives of fellow soldiers in combat situations. These guards aren't just ceremonial figures. They're elite soldiers who have proven themselves in the most challenging circumstances." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had been mocking and harassing a war hero, someone who had risked his life in service to his country and had been recognized for extraordinary courage. The businessman's face went white as he realized the full extent of his mistake and the depth of disrespect he had shown. Sarah gasped audibly when she heard about James's military record. She had supported various military charities back home and understood exactly what combat decorations meant. "Marcus," she whispered urgently, "do you understand what you just did? You harassed a decorated war veteran who was doing his job." The crowd around them had grown larger as word spread about the incident. Many tourists were now openly taking photos and videos, not of the guards, but of Marcus and his family. Comments in multiple languages could be heard, but the tone was universally disapproving. The businessman realized he had become the villain in a story that was spreading in real time across social media platforms. Jake pulled out his phone and quickly searched for hashtags related to Windsor Castle and Royal Guards. What he found made his heart sink. Videos of his father's behavior were already being uploaded with titles like entitled, American Tourist vs. Royal Guard and Tourist Gets Reality Check from Professional Soldier. The view counts were climbing rapidly, and the comments were overwhelmingly critical of Marcus's behavior. A family from Canada approached the area where Marcus stood with his family. The father, who wore a military veteran's cap, spoke directly to Marcus with barely controlled anger. That soldier you were disrespecting has done more for freedom and security than you'll ever understand. The fact that he showed such restraint with you is a testament to his professionalism, not weakness. His words carried the weight of personal experience, and Marcus couldn't meet his eyes. Robert returned with a clipboard and paperwork, making it clear that the incident was far from over. Sir, I need you to provide your identification and contact information for our report. While you're not being arrested, this incident will be documented and shared with relevant authorities. The official nature of the process was another reminder that Marcus's actions had real consequences beyond social embarrassment. As more people learned about James's military background, the mood in the crowd shifted from disapproval to active respect for the guard and disgust toward Marcus. Several veterans in the crowd made comments about military service and the importance of showing proper respect to soldiers. The contrast between James's dignity and Marcus's behavior became even more stark as the full context emerged. Marcus finally began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. He wasn't just dealing with social embarrassment or vacation inconvenience. He had publicly disrespected a decorated combat veteran while representing his country as a tourist abroad. The incident would likely follow him long after he returned home to Texas, and there was no way to undo the damage he had caused to his own reputation and that of American tourists in general. As Robert prepared the incident report, Marcus found himself surrounded by an increasingly hostile crowd of onlookers. What had begun as his personal entertainment had transformed into a public trial, where he stood as the sole defendant. The weight of dozens of disapproving stares and the constant clicking of camera phones created an atmosphere of judgment that he had never experienced before. A retired British colonel, distinguished by his bearing and the military insignia on his jacket, approached Marcus with measured steps. His voice carried the authority of decades of military service as he spoke. Young man, I've commanded soldiers like Guardsman Mitchell. They represent the finest qualities of military service: discipline, honor, and selfless dedication. Your behavior today has been a disgrace not only to yourself but to your country. Marcus tried to formulate a response, but found himself speechless in the face of such direct criticism from someone who clearly commanded respect from everyone around him. The colonel's words hung in the air like a verdict, and the businessman realized that any attempt to defend his actions would only make him appear more foolish. Sarah, overwhelmed by shame and anger, finally lost her composure with her husband. 45 years old, Marcus. You're 45 years old and acting like a spoiled child. This man served his country in war and you treated him like he was there for your amusement. Her voice carried across the courtyard, and even tourists who hadn't witnessed the original incident began to understand what had happened. Jake, meanwhile, was experiencing his own crisis as he watched his father's public humiliation unfold. The teenager had always looked up to Marcus as a successful businessman who commanded respect in their hometown. Seeing him reduced to a figure of ridicule and contempt was destroying illusions that Jake had held about his father for years. James continued his duty with remarkable composure, but the incident had clearly affected the entire guard unit. Other soldiers maintained their posts while observing the aftermath, their professional solidarity evident in their shared commitment to discipline despite the disruption. Their collective dignity stood in sharp contrast to the chaos Marcus had created. A group of American tourists, recognizing Marcus's accent as their own, approached with expressions of embarrassment and concern. One woman wearing a Veterans Organization t-shirt spoke quietly but firmly. "Sir, you're making all Americans look bad over here. These people are going to remember this incident and think poorly of all of us because of how you acted." The businessman looked around desperately for any support or sympathy but found none. Even his own family was distancing themselves from him, with Sarah standing several feet away and Jake pretending to be interested in his phone. The isolation was complete and devastating for someone who was accustomed to being the center of positive attention in his business and social circles. Robert completed the paperwork and handed Marcus a copy of the incident report. "Sir, you're free to continue your visit, but I strongly recommend that you maintain appropriate behavior for the remainder of your time at the castle. Any further incidents will result in immediate removal from the premises and potential legal action." As word of the incident spread through the castle grounds, more people began arriving to see the aftermath. Tour guides were quietly updating their groups about what had happened, using Marcus's behavior as an example of how not to interact with the guards. The businessman had unwittingly become a cautionary tale told throughout Windsor Castle. A local journalist, who had been visiting the castle with her family, approached Marcus with a recorder and notebook. "Excuse me, sir, I'm with the Windsor Observer. Would you care to comment on your interaction with the guard today?" The question sent a chill through Marcus as he realized the incident might make local news, potentially reaching an even wider audience than social media. Marcus declined to comment and tried to move away from the journalist, but her presence was another reminder that his actions had consequences beyond personal embarrassment. The story of an American tourist harassing a decorated war veteran would likely be picked up by multiple news outlets, both in Britain and potentially back in the United States. Sarah made the decision for the family, grabbing both her husband and son by the arms. "We're leaving. Right now. This vacation is over." Her voice left no room for argument, and Marcus found himself being physically guided away from the scene of his humiliation. The walk toward the castle exit felt endless as tourists continued to stare and comment. As they moved through the castle grounds, other visitors they passed seemed to recognize them from the incident. Whispers and pointed fingers followed their progress, and Marcus realized that their remaining time in Britain would be spent under a cloud of notoriety. The businessman who had arrived that morning feeling like a successful tourist was leaving as a symbol of ugly American behavior abroad. Jake broke his silence as they approached the parking area. "Dad, this is going to be everywhere online by tonight. My friends are going to see this. Everyone back home is going to see this." The teenager's words carried a mixture of anger and despair that hit Marcus harder than any criticism from strangers. Back at the guard post, James maintained his position with perfect professionalism, but the incident had created a buzz of activity among castle staff and other guards. Senior officers were being briefed on what had happened, and additional security measures were being discussed to prevent similar situations in the future. The crowd that had witnessed the confrontation gradually dispersed, but many tourists lingered to take respectful photos with James and to express their admiration for his handling of the situation. The guard's professional response had become a point of pride for British visitors and a source of education for international tourists about the proper way to interact with royal guards. As Marcus's family reached their rental car, the full scope of his mistake began to settle in. He had come to Windsor Castle expecting to create amusing content for social media, and had instead generated a viral incident that portrayed him as an ignorant, disrespectful tourist. The consequences would extend far beyond their vacation, affecting his business reputation and family relationships for months or years to come. The drive back to their hotel was conducted in complete silence. With each family member processing the day's events in their own way, Marcus stared out the window at the British countryside, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his error in judgment and the lasting damage he had caused to his own reputation and that of his country. The aftermath of Marcus's confrontation with Guardsman James Mitchell extended far beyond the walls of Windsor Castle. Within hours of the incident, multiple videos from different angles had been uploaded to social media platforms, with captions that ranged from humorous commentary to serious discussions about respect for military service members. The hashtag Windsor Guard Incident began trending as the story spread across international news outlets. At their London hotel that evening, Marcus sat on the edge of his bed staring at his phone in disbelief as notifications continued to pour in. The video he had originally recorded for his own entertainment was now being shared thousands of times, but not with the reaction he had expected. Comments from viewers around the world condemned his behavior, with many people sharing stories of their own military service or that of family members. Sarah had spent the afternoon on the phone with their travel agent, trying to change their flight home to an earlier date. The stress of the day's events, combined with the ongoing embarrassment of being recognized by other hotel guests, had made their remaining vacation days seem impossible to endure. She had also received concerned calls from friends back home who had already seen the videos online. Jake discovered that his social media accounts were being flooded with messages from classmates who had recognized his family in the background of the viral videos. The teenager was faced with the prospect of returning to school as the son of the man who had harassed a war hero, a reputation that would likely follow him throughout his remaining high school years. Meanwhile, back at Windsor Castle, James had completed his shift and was finally able to break from his ceremonial position. His fellow guardsmen gathered around him in the guardhouse, offering support and praise for his professional handling of the difficult situation. The incident had already become legendary within the guard, with senior officers commending James for maintaining the dignity of his position, while effectively dealing with a genuine threat. Captain Williams, James's commanding officer, called him into his office for a formal debriefing. "Mitchell, I've been in the Guard for 15 years and I've never seen a more textbook example of proper protocol under pressure. You maintained ceremonial discipline while clearly demonstrating why tourists need to respect our authority. Well done." James appreciated the recognition but remained characteristically modest about his response. "Sir, it was simply a matter of applying our training. The individual posed a potential threat to security, and I responded according to protocol. I'm grateful that the situation was resolved without further incident." The story of Marcus's humiliation reached international news networks by the following morning. BBC News ran a segment about proper tourist behavior at royal sites, using the incident as a teaching moment about respecting cultural institutions and military personnel. American news outlets picked up the story as an example of the ugly American stereotype, with several commentators using it to discuss broader issues of cultural sensitivity and respect. Back in Texas, Marcus's business associates began calling with concerns about how the incident might affect their company's reputation. The oil industry, despite its rough reputation, still valued professional conduct and respect for military service members. Several clients expressed discomfort about being associated with someone who had publicly disrespected a decorated veteran. Marcus's local veterans organization, where he had been a nominal member, quietly removed him from their membership rolls. The organization's president, a Vietnam veteran, sent a brief letter explaining that Marcus's actions were incompatible with their values of supporting and respecting military service members, both active and retired. The incident also had unexpected positive consequences for the Queen's Guard as an institution. Tourism to Windsor Castle increased as people came hoping to meet the guard who had handled the situation so professionally. James found himself something of a celebrity among visitors, though he continued to maintain perfect military bearing while on duty. A week after the incident, Marcus received an unexpected phone call at his hotel. The caller identified himself as a representative from a British veterans charity that had learned about the incident through news coverage. The man explained that they had been contacted by numerous people who wanted to make donations in honor of James's professionalism and service. "Sir," the charity representative said, "we've received over £50,000 in donations from people around the world who were inspired by Guardsman Mitchell's conduct. While we appreciate that this incident may have been difficult for you, it has resulted in significant support for veteran services." The call was both humbling and enlightening for Marcus, showing him how his actions had inadvertently highlighted the positive qualities of military service. When Marcus and his family finally returned to Texas, they found that the story had preceded them. Local news stations had picked up the international coverage, and Marcus's neighbors were well aware of what had happened at Windsor Castle. The businessman who had left for vacation as a respected member of his community returned to find his reputation permanently altered. Jake's first day back at school was particularly challenging. As he had predicted, his classmates had seen the videos and created memes featuring his father's confrontation with the guard. While some friends offered support, the teenager realized that the incident would be a defining moment of his high school experience. Sarah, meanwhile, began the difficult process of rebuilding their family's social standing in their community. She volunteered for local veterans organizations and made substantial donations to military charities, hoping to demonstrate that the family understood the seriousness of Marcus's mistake and was committed to making amends. 6 months after the incident, Marcus had lost several business contracts and had to rebuild his company's reputation through extensive community service and public apologies. He established a scholarship fund for children of military families and began speaking to business groups about the importance of cultural sensitivity when traveling abroad. James Mitchell continued his service with the Queen's Guard, eventually being promoted to Lance Corporal in recognition of his exemplary conduct. He never spoke publicly about the incident with Marcus, maintaining the professional discretion that had made him an ideal representative of military values. The viral video of Marcus's humiliation served as a lasting reminder that in an age of social media and instant global communication, inappropriate behavior can have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. What began as one man's attempt to entertain himself at the expense of a dedicated soldier became a powerful lesson about respect, dignity, and the true meaning of professional service. The incident at Windsor Castle ultimately demonstrated that while tourists may come and go, the values represented by institutions like the Queen's Guard, honor, duty, and unwavering professionalism, remain constant and command respect from people around the world. Marcus learned too late that some things are simply not meant for entertainment, and that true strength lies not in mocking others, but in showing respect for those who serve with dignity and honor.